You're listening to Data Science Leaders, the premier podcast for executives tackling the world's most important challenges using the power of machine learning. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome. Today we are extremely fortunate to have with us James Cham. He is the partner at the venture capital firm Bloomberg Beta, and he has a ringside view into the latest and greatest when it comes to artificial intelligence technologies generally. And I would love to start with the question, which is really on, I think, most people's minds right now, which is what's working when it comes to generative AI? How are folks actually driving impact with this?
The exciting thing about generative AI right now is that parts of it are actually working. And the parts that are working are mostly around productivity, right? That really right now, the truth is it's like those one-on-one interactions with the models where you end up doing work that you can check and explore new ideas. And that piece clearly is doing interesting things. Now, the funny thing about, of course, like that kind of productivity, personal productivity process is like there's always a man in the middle. There's always a person in the loop, which is to say the person who's actually interacting with the models or with the machines. The funny thing there is like there are a surprising number of things that it does very, very well. And sort of that's the fun part. But of course, like that's not enough, right? Sort of we're stuck constantly generating more fake spam or easier to write professional, sort of reviews of people. That'd be kind of a terrible world to live in, right? If we just ended up generating more paper. And so that's the actual fear, right? The actual fear is we spend all our time over the next 20 years using these LLMs to like make bureaucracy a little more efficient or a little worse.
Well, it feels a little bit like cognitive search going back 20 years ago, say, where it was like, oh my goodness, we can now go in and leverage all of the information on the internet. It's on our fingertips. And so now we would use internet search on a daily, hourly, minute-by-minute basis. But it didn't change the world. It didn't change everything that we were doing. And when it comes to generative AI, I think all of our hopes have been that, my goodness, this is going to go and revolutionize field after field or different aspects of our lives. But really, we're seeing it go down the path of every other technology, which is there's certain very natural use cases which it gravitates towards first. And the case that those are kind of shaking out now.
That's the fear, right? The fear is that we get stuck in a local minimum for too long, where we spend all our time with sort of vague co-pilots that like do a little bit more or less. And all the opportunities and all the sort of like short-term interesting opportunities are like attractive, and I don't want to diminish them, but they do obscure from like the actual opportunity to transform the way people do work, which has been, our focus for the last decade, right? The broad mandate of the firm initially was to invest in the future of work, and whether that meant, sort of investing in faster databases or artificial intelligence, like that's been part of the goal. And the interesting thing has been to like spend time with economists and social scientists as they talk about previous examples of technology changing, right? And there's a way in which, even though with generative AI right now, you feel like there's a new technical innovation almost every month, right? Where like, whatever, 6 months ago, you thought you'd like fine tune models one way, and then now you feel like there's another, like a different way. Like all that sort of stuff is constantly changing in processes, right? And then like the imagination of human managers about how they redesign work, that's the part that's still going to take time. And that's kind of like, that's going to be the durable, interesting thing.
Gotcha. I mean, I'm reminded of the invention of the steam engine. What was it originally designed for? It was not for going and powering locomotives. It was for extracting water out of mines. And it took a couple of innovations later on to realize, no, this is going to revolutionize transportation as we know it. And it feels like maybe we're in a similar situation whereby, well, great, we've unlocked a couple of killer use cases. I guess in addition to the personal productivity and cognitive search use cases, I guess I'm seeing certain customer service automation use cases whereby you can offload a lot of things that you put in call centers now onto a large language model. Also seeing incredible things that are happening over the biopharma space when it comes to peptide and protein discovery. But it feels like there's this opportunity for additional innovations in the uses of these technologies that that's a problem of the moment right now.
I mean, I think like part of it, the dynamic is like the chat interfaces are not quite enough yet, right? That there's still innovation or new product discovery to be done in how those conversations happen and how those interactions work. The interesting thing is like look at something like Perplexity, right? Which, like shows on the one hand, like what's possible. I assume everyone's played with Perplexity. If you haven't, you should. It's a replacement for your search engine. In that case, what they end up doing is they end up sort of searching the web for you and then composing pages to sort of that synthesize different links and different articles and different images in a way that's interesting. But the part of what's fascinating about it is it actually feels coherent as a product, right? That actually there's graphic design, it's laid out the right way. There's like next steps, there's social, there's sharing, like all those sorts of pieces all come together.
It's not just the technology.
That's right. That's right. And then like those sorts of opportunities, those sort of like product feature discovery, right? All of that is stuff that's happening right now. And the folks that figure out it early or figure out ways to exploit those new product features, like that'll be interesting, right? And that's sort of like the fun part of sort of building businesses and building AI first products right now.
Yeah. I mean, you could sort of say, I mean, that's sort of the reason why we're talking about generative AI right now is arguably because ChatGPT was such a big deal. And what was it that ChatGPT brought to the table? It wasn't the large language models. We'd already had those for a good amount of time. We'd been talking about transformer models since 2017. But what it offered was a user experience. It offered an application that everybody could go and engage in. And so now it's a question of, okay, well, so what are those additional experiences? What are those additional proper applications that we can base these off of?
And like that raises like one other interesting angle, which is like ChatGPT and OpenAI's work with ChatGPT didn't just represent like improvement of technology or a good product. Both of those are true. But the other thing that it represented actually genuine bravery on the part of management. That there's a way in which they understood well enough like all the bad things that could happen. And they had the fortitude to say, oh, you know what? It's going to screw up in all these ways, and we're going to just take the punches, right? And I think that willingness and that sort of almost that faith that, hey, we understand this dynamic and we understand that models, get better and we can improve them. And that sort of intuition, which most companies and most, to be honest, executives don't really understand. Like that's the thing in many ways that made ChatGPT different experience than, let's say, every other, Microsoft and Facebook and et cetera, all have released chatbots in the past. And part of the problem wasn't just the technology, but also the culture of the place and the willingness to understand the core dynamics of how models get better over time, if only you are willing to let them.
Absolutely. Well, to that point, I mean, on the one hand, there's a lot of certainly excitement and interest and, for lack of a better term, trust when it comes to that generative AI is going to change our businesses. So there's a lot of executive leadership and direction towards organizations that we're going to invest in artificial intelligence. And then it's now up to somebody, a position or two further down the organization, to go in and figure out, well, so what does that mean? How am I going to go in and act on this mandate that I've now been given? Would love your thoughts on what they need to do. When I hear some of these individuals, the first thing they would like for is an easy button. The first thing they like is like, can I have a partner who will figure this out for me? Can I go and turn to OpenAI or to one of the cloud vendors, and they're just going to tell me what I need to do and provide everything that I need to create this sort of new wave of generative AI applications? I haven't seen any evidence of that being a successful approach. And as an industry analyst, I was constantly lambasting the cloud vendors for not investing more in usable AI services. But curious what you're seeing. Are you seeing that there is an easy button? There is an ability to outsource these capabilities either to technology vendors or solution vendors, or is this one where organizations really do need to go in and invest in their own in-house capabilities and develop it from the ground up?
I mean, that's always such a tricky question, right? Because there's always the fear that you spend all of your time rebuilding everything, right? And that's a dangerous waste of money unless you're, incredibly profitable. But at the same time, the danger that I think lots of companies are in right now is that a lot of senior executives have been lulled into thinking that they've tamed AI, that they feel like they understand it right now, and that there's a whole set of turns around what these models will be good at that will change expectations around the product, right? And there's almost a way in which the desire to make them like less scary by using terms like copilot or talking about it in terms of a chatbot, like those obscure like the really transformative opportunities. And there's a great big debate right now, which we'll find out in 10 years, about whether big companies are going to actually take advantage of LLMs or whether it's going to be reliant on small companies willing to try new things to actually change the industry. And so I feel like that's one of those big questions out there.
I'm always stunned by how frequently we touch on the topics of disruption and Clay Christensen's work there. And yet again, this feels like an area whereby maybe the large organizations are not going to be the ones who leverage this, and instead it's going to be brought around either by startups or small teams that are going and using these, and then maybe, hopefully, larger organizations going in and being able to establish separate teams who have the creativity and the ability to go in and create entirely new processes that go in and are built from the ground up around these technologies.
There's always a funny game for vendors of big organizations that they have to play, where on the one hand, they oftentimes will know what's the right solution for an organization, but at the same time, the organization might not be ready to accept it, right? Or might not be willing to sort of like reorganize or think that way. And I imagine that dynamic is happening in big and small levels all over the place right now. And like as a VC, sort of my goal is to find the things that are on the one hand disruptive, but also legible enough to the market that no one's going to say, oh, they were too early to market or they were ahead of their time, right? And part of what's exciting right now is there is great willingness to pay and to try things on the part of many, many customers. And, you think about like the nature of innovation or of new things. It's not just a question of supply, it's a supply and demand relationship, right? That you need organizations that are willing to take those risks and are willing to try those things. And you're seeing enough of that, right? And that's part of what's exciting.
Absolutely. Would love your thoughts when it comes to then how they go about doing this. I mean, one of the promises, potentially a false promise of generative AI, was that we didn't have to worry about the model. We can go in and have somebody else will develop it, someone else will operationalize it. All I need to do is prompt engineering and RAG, and I can use this off the shelf. And all of a sudden, this becomes a software development problem primarily versus a data science challenge. And again, I have not seen examples yet where that actually worked. Where it has been working is, sure, it was a software challenge that was being run by data scientists, often as a data science project. And sure, they were using APIs and they were using sometimes third-party hosted models, but because of their understanding of how to build a data application, a machine learning-based data application, they were able to go in and figure out where the pitfalls were and go and figure out how to get the data that they needed, transform the data,
Right.
use the model in the sensible way, test it in the sensible way, and create a user experience that actually aligned to what the business needed. That or seeing something else.
So, look, I was a mediocre software developer for many, many years. And the reality is that I never really cared about any of the data that I stored or processed, except to the extent that when I had to write a QA script or describe the requirements, I sort of said, oh, it needs to show up in this way or that way. And I hope these numbers add up, right? That's to be honest, like the way that a software developer thinks, right? You're like, oh, I got some requirements. Does it work or not work? And there's a way in which the shape of the data actually affects the applications that are and the ways that applications are built today that's very different than the way you would have thought about software development 10, 20, 30 years ago. And I think like that shift, which is a one in which the data actually dramatically affects the application, that world is one where we're just getting used to. And that's the world where like programmers who are able to string together components will not do as well as statistically minded people who know how to do a little bit of Python scripting.
There are two elements on that data issue. One of them is that there's traditionally been this relationship between the data and the business use case and the model that you develop. I jokingly refer to it as the iron triangle. And the problem is that you often don't know at the start of a project what it is that you have or that is needed, what kind of model you'll need to develop. And often the business will give you one set of use cases and requirements, but what they actually need, they won't know until they actually see it. And so there's an element whereby you need to be even more agile than you would need to be on a traditional software development project, because you're going to have to iterate through all of those different components simultaneously.
I mean, there's a little bit of this thing where software development for data-driven applications are fundamentally different than like traditional software development. Where I don't know, when I was a software developer, I had two tricks. I could either cut scope or I could ask for more time, right? But at the core, I believe I could build whatever I promised to build because, of course, I could build it. It's not like, it was like there wasn't that much technical risk. And what's interesting now is that there's signal risk. There's a question of like, in the data, is there enough juice in the data to actually make this application useful or allow you to do this or that? And I think like that signal risk is something that's actually one of the bigger issues for good software developers, because good software developers have always known the two tricks I mentioned, right? Less time, more time, less scope, and that's always the answer. But the idea that, oh, if I spend a few more hours or I spend an infinite amount of time, there's just not enough juice in the data, like that as an idea is something that I think we're just getting used to and still struggling with, to be honest.
No, absolutely. I guess it strikes me that there's another dimension when it comes to the data, which is that at the end of the day, we're talking about unstructured or semi-structured data, and we haven't generally been great at leveraging that in our software development projects. And when it comes to generative AI, this is all about unstructured and semi-structured data, either on the recognizing patterns in it or part of it, or in the generation part of it.
Sure, sure. Or even just exploring the relationships between types of structured data, right? I think there's another company I invested in called Tonic, and in their case, they generate synthetic data for applications for like developers to then test their applications because they actually care about like the data and they want to see whether or not it actually is coherent and it makes sense. And someone who's like that as a problem is something I might have cared about 20 years ago, but not nearly enough, right? And I think like that whole like data dependent or data driven or data whatever powered application development is very different, right? And we don't have a great language around that yet.
Absolutely.
Except for data scientists, right? Data scientists do think that way. And like there's a funny game where, part of it is that data scientists, though, are not coherent product thinkers. And so like the challenge right now is one of the great questions is, will data scientists become coherent product thinkers faster than programmers become good statisticians?
Presumably, it's going to be one of those things where there'll be a division of labor. We're going to be talking about this as it being a team effort and by identifying those separate roles. I do want to take this opportunity to ask you about decisions and advances in decision-making technology, because the last time we spoke was roughly a year ago. AutoGPT had come out, and we were all really excited about the possibility of leveraging large language models to be much more active in the human decision-making process. And usually when I hear folks talking about potentially catastrophic events when it comes to artificial intelligence, it's usually because of some sort of automated system whereby the LLM is taking a crucial role in making those decisions. I don't feel like in that intervening time, like I've seen a whole lot of advances when it comes to improvements on the decision-making part itself. Plenty of improvements on the model, but I'm seeing folks actually pull out those decisions from your large language models and have them be done by traditional methods, predictive AI methods. Have you seen any advances on that?
I mean, I think that the interesting thing is that the current best practice around LLMs like becoming independent is just incredibly expensive. That the number of calls you need to make and the number of checks on checks or coherency checks or all the sorts of things that you might do, like that's still too expensive. But the thing is like this is just going to get cheaper. Now, will this get 10x cheaper or 10,000x cheaper is sort of like an open question. There's a fair question that I think a lot of people are asking around like the sort of the theoretical bounds of these sort of flexible models, right? And so it's very possible that we'll live in a world where everyone has slightly tuned, customized models for specific use cases. So it's very possible we'll have that world on the one hand. But I bet you that the most successful companies will be really aggressive around how they do and rely on these systems to do agent-like things, right? That's going to be where all the huge leverage happens. And I've only seen hints of it, right? I've only seen hints of it here and there. I have a friend who runs a marketing agency and they generate like huge chunks of data that people buy but never really look at. And in his case, he started using the models to explicitly make a few observations looking through the data. And like those observations were not perfect, but by the way, they were better than what they were doing before, which is to say nothing. And that's changed his relationship with his customers fundamentally, because now rather than just being a source of data, he's also like a like a trusted advisor, because now he will say something like, oh, you know what, I noticed that like over the last 5 months, sort of these three things have changed in your ad mix or whatever, right? And those sorts of observations, those used to be expensive, right? Those used to be expensive and not reasonable to do if you had lots of customers. And now it's entirely automated, and he feels good enough about it to just generate it and send it out, right? And with various caveats, and his customers like him more as a result. And by the way, his incremental cost, right, is just not that much. I feel like those are the sorts of games or tactics that folks are just starting to discover.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like a best practice of learning out of this is to be on the lookout for those kinds of activities where these technologies can really dramatically bring down the cost of those. But it sounds like there's also even a meta point around this, which is, and also keep an eye out on the fact that, okay, that might be too expensive. Certain of these things might be too expensive to do with generative models right now, but the economics of that are changing very dramatically. And some of those problems that are just not economically feasible right now, that could be very different in a couple of months.
That's right. And there's a way in which, like, it's possible that these models will just never, that will continue to hallucinate in weird ways, right? It's entirely possible that there are a whole set of like sort of research questions that will remain research questions for a long, long time. And as a result of that, we'll have to paper it over the way that we always paper over software mistakes. We'll write business rules, we'll write checks, we'll do all the things we normally do. And when you do that, we'll be fine, right? And I think like there's a dream of like the perfect technical solution. I think that's going to obscure many, many opportunities in the short and medium term.
As always, we're hoping for one thing to solve it all, and actually, well, it's not like we don't have a whole lot of crutches, a whole lot of earlier methods that we can be using in tandem together with these technologies, and really, we should be on the lookout for adjacencies, complementarities. I'm leveraging predictive AI predictive AI together with generative AI, or optimization techniques together with predictive AI and generative AI techniques.
Because they're like, even though so much of it feels different, there are core parts of this question of like, you have a model, it generates something, you evaluate it, you figure out whether or not to accept or reject it, you figure out whether or not to try to improve the model, all those sorts of questions. Those are age old and they will continue to be interesting. And there's almost a way in which like having an organization that actually understands that and internalizes, that's going to be more valuable than whether or not you decide to adopt, whatever new RAG library that you're trying to figure out whether or not to use today.
Going back to Clay Christensen and thinking about how you can develop the capabilities for disrupting your own internal processes and applying these technologies in new ways and making them core to your processes is going to be valuable, whether or not this is for generative AI or whether it is for any other future technology development that's coming down the pike. Curious your thoughts on the intersection between things like generative AI and other emerging or disruptive technologies. So taking generative AI and all of the excitement that existed around quantum computing. I mean, we could view there as being, okay, well, potentially there's synergies between these, or we could view this that, well, generative AI is just going to suck all of the oxygen away from most of these other emerging technologies because that's where we're seeing the best economic opportunities with it.
I mean, there's a little bit of like the nature of the world we live in right now is that in part because information transaction costs are so low, you end up with like sort of superstar effects where everyone crowds around certain types of ideas. And that ends up being good and bad. It's bad from a overall system point of view because maybe everyone prematurely optimizes or everyone focuses on one set of solutions. I'd say that like the interesting thing is that sort of there are plenty of opportunities for folks in adjacent technologies to figure out ways that they can solve some of these problems around generative AI right now or address them. For better or worse, that's a game you're going to have to play. There's like a way in which I remember talking many years ago to a friend who like used to be doing cancer research and suddenly was doing age research. I was like, why are you doing age research? Like, but we're still doing the same research. We're just actually like solving a slightly different described use case, which really meant he had a slightly different go-to-market, right? It's kind of one of those funny things where you go where like the attention is and you take advantage of that. And so for those who sort of are feeling stubborn, I think like that's good. You should be stubborn because like why not be able to try to impose your will on the world? But at the same time, I'd also say that like, there's a way in which you should go with the grain of the world, right? Like right now, there's going to be enough interest and enough like new things happening and enough uncertain around generative AI that like folks should be playing there, right? Because that's where like the opportunity is.
I'm always reminded of the the XKCD comic that was talking about what would you do if all of your friends were jumping off of a bridge? And it's like, well, yeah, I probably would because most of my friends are super smart individuals. And if they're jumping off the bridge, there's probably something that they know that I don't know.
Which really works as a strategy, except when it doesn't.
Indeed. Potential catastrophic outcomes there. In terms of things that you're most excited about one of these technologies, whether that be as an investor or whether as a technologist or just as a regular human being, is there anything that you're seeing that you're just blown away by, that you're looking forward to in the next year or two?
I think that, sort of what are the things that I'm most interested in? I'm very interested in product thinkers going into this market, right? And so that's exciting. I'm very, very interested in voice-based applications. I think that voice remains one of these underutilized sort of places to play. And we're just to the point where these models are going to be fast enough that the reaction time is going to be like half a second to a second. And in that case, then you actually end up with things that feel like real conversation. And so I think that lots of opportunities there. I think that, one place that I think everyone is sort of playing around but doesn't really understand right now is, so tell me what happens when we really unleash the agents, right? And sort of and the first place you're going to see this is basically a lot of things that look like RPA, right? Where a lot of agents are going to go around on browsers, clicking on random things, extracting information, doing this and that in structured ways.
Well, I'm happy that you say that versus fraud and misinformation.
Well, we'll have fraud and misinformation too, right? I'm sure that'll be terrible, right? But I think as far as the interesting straightforward opportunities that are sitting out there, we went from command line to GUI in 1985, and in many ways GUI is kind of a terrible mistake, right? They're really slow and inefficient and terrible, and it's deeply ironic now that we're now, for a lot of these applications, we're in a world where we're now relying on these agents, to then go and actually do the pointing and clicking for us so that you can collect information. And so I think there'll be lots of interesting, weird opportunities that come out of that.
Gotcha. I mean, I think about GUIs as one of those instances where it was changing our interaction with technology as humans. And it sounds like between either the agents or when it comes to this voice opportunities, again, this is another opportunity to change the way that everybody is working with technology and getting benefit from it.
And it's also helpful at times like this right now to think, oh, what doesn't change about people? We're still lazy. We still go after the easy solutions. GUIs, again, are great for the first 2 minutes. But then if you're actually doing the same thing over and over again for years, GUIs are actually kind of terrible, right? And so it's kind of ironic that we live in a world now where we're going to have to get this entire new layer of matrix, large language models that see vision in order to replace and redo some of the things that someone built, to do 10 years ago or 20 years ago. And so that world of layering upon layering is probably what we're going to see plenty.
There's a glorious irony in this. It sounds like, well, your key to success with generative AI is to really understand people a lot better.
That's almost always been true, right? That's almost always been true. And it'll be more true now, right? So that'll be fun.
James, thank you very, very much for joining us, for sharing your thoughts. If folks want to follow you and find out more about your thoughts and what you're doing, is there a best way for folks to?
I'm on the social networks at James Cham, CHAM, or folks can email me, james@bloombergbeta.com. And, many years ago, I was lucky enough to invest in Domino early on. And that was a mixture of my having a point of view, but also just recognizing the talent of the founders, right? And the possibility of the market. And so I'm always looking for that feeling again, right? That feeling of finding oh, this is going to be the next big thing. And that's part of what makes this job fun.
Thank you very much for joining us.
You've been listening to Data Science Leaders from Domino Data Lab. If you found our discussion insightful, be sure to subscribe to never miss an episode. Your support helps us deliver cutting-edge content and keep the data science community informed and inspired. We appreciate every review. Until next time.